let me ask you something. What happens when a rising nation finally decides it will no longer play by old rules written thousands of miles away? What happens when a country that once depended on big powers suddenly says enough? We choose our own destiny. Today, we uncover why India made a decision that shook the global market, and why this moment is far bigger than politics, far bigger than economics, and far bigger than anyone expected. India's decision to step away from long-standing trade patterns began with one powerful realization: dependence is dangerous. For years, India relied heavily on a handful of external partners to fuel its growth, supply its technology, and shape its market direction. On the surface, this seemed efficient. It created access to global goods, new investments, and advanced systems. But beneath that surface lay a flaw. Whoever controls your supply chain controls your speed, your choices, and your future. India understood that as long as it remained tied to a system built by others, its progress would always be limited by someone else's interests. This is where the shift began. India looked around the global landscape and noticed a pattern. The countries dominating world power weren't the ones depending on others. They were the ones others depended on. That thought alone changed everything. India saw that every time it tried to push ahead in critical sectors, whether it was technology, defense, manufacturing, or pharmaceuticals, it faced roadblocks, pressure, or unpredictability. Agreements came with strings, tariffs came with warnings, support came with expectations, and slowly, this dependence stopped feeling like cooperation and started feeling like control. So India asked itself a daring question: what happens if we remove these limits? That question became a mission. India began investing heavily in strengthening its domestic industries, building its own alternatives, and reducing the leverage any foreign nation had over its economic future. It wasn't about breaking relationships, it was about breaking restrictions. The more India strengthened itself, the clearer the picture became. True progress doesn't come from leaning on others, it comes from standing tall. This independence wasn't born out of pride alone, it came from strategy. India knew that to lead globally, it first had to break free locally, and once that clarity arrived, stepping away from old trade dependencies was not a gamble. It was the most calculated move India could make. The trade agreements that once guided India's relationship with major global partners were designed for an earlier version of the country, and India still building its foundation, still reaching for stability, still fighting to secure its place in the world economy. Back then, these deals made sense. They opened doors, attracted investment, and created opportunities that helped India rise. But as India transformed into a global force, the deals did not evolve with it. What once felt like support began to feel like limitation. India's ambitions had grown, but the agreements around it remained stuck in the past. This mismatch became obvious whenever India attempted to expand into higher value industries. Whether it was renewable energy, digital infrastructure, advanced manufacturing, or data-driven technology, India realized that the old frameworks offered little flexibility. They were designed for an India that imported more than it created, that followed more than it led. But the present India wanted to shape the future, not simply participate in it. The contracts and conditions no longer reflected its strength, its size, or its potential. Every nation reaches a moment when it must decide whether to accept old expectations or rewrite its story. For India, that moment came when it saw that these deals weren't built for equality. They didn't recognize India as an equal partner with equal influence. They didn't acknowledge the scale of India's market, the force of its workforce, or the power of its innovation. Instead, the terms felt outdated, like someone else was still defining the limits of India's growth. So India chose not to renew, not to adjust, but to redefine. It stepped away from agreements that kept it in a smaller frame. By doing so, India sent a message to the world. If the world won't make room for the India of today, then India will make its own room. For decades, the world saw India as a place where work was cheap, labor was abundant, and large companies could outsource without thinking twice. That image suited global powers because it kept India predictable and dependent, but something changed. India no longer wanted to be known only as a service hub. It wanted to be recognized as a creator, an innovator, a nation shaping the future instead of just supporting it. This shift wasn't loud at first. It began quietly with small breakthroughs, bold young entrepreneurs, and a government willing to bet on technology-driven growth. As India invested in artificial intelligence, semiconductor production, renewable energy, digital governance, robotics, space technology, and defense innovation, its identity evolved. Suddenly, India wasn't following global trends, it was setting them. The world was surprised. Many didn't expect India to rise so quickly in high-tech fields that only a handful of nations controlled. But India showed that innovation is not about who has dominated the past. It's about who is building the future. With this rise came a realization. The old trade structures did not support innovation. They were built around the assumption that India would always provide low-cost labor while importing high-value technology. But India was no longer satisfied with that trade imbalance. It wanted to build its own chips instead of buying them. It wanted to export green energy solutions instead of depending on others for fuel. It wanted to patent ideas, not just process them. The global hierarchy didn't adjust to this new reality, so India decided to break free from it. Innovation became India's leverage, its bargaining power, its shield, its offense and defense, and this shift in identity from follower to pioneer made the old agreements irrelevant. Innovation gave India what dependency never could, control over its own destiny. The pressure India faced in global trade wasn't just economic, it was psychological. Every tariff, every restriction, every warning from established powers was meant to remind India of its place in the global hierarchy. These pressures were supposed to limit India's confidence, slow its momentum, and force it to compromise. But instead of shrinking under that weight, India used it as fuel. Pressure became motivation. Challenges became training, and every obstacle that others thought would weaken India only sharpened its resolve. When certain nations tightened rules around technology exports, India responded by building its own technologies. When barriers blocked Indian goods from entering certain markets, India strengthened its domestic manufacturing. When outside forces attempted to sway India's policy decisions, India doubled down on self-reliance. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The more pressure India faced, the more innovative and independent it became. It wasn't reacting emotionally, it was reacting strategically. This transformation wasn't immediate. It took years of trial, failure, correction, and reinvention, but each setback pushed India to explore new industries, new partnerships, and new supply chains. Instead of relying on imported essentials, India boosted its agricultural output, expanded its energy network, and encouraged local businesses to scale globally. What began as defensive measures soon turned into offensive opportunities. India also recognized that economic pressure exposed vulnerabilities, areas where the country needed to grow stronger. Instead of hiding these weaknesses, India confronted them head-on. It built world-class digital public infrastructure, improved ease of doing business, and invested in sectors that could not be threatened by foreign influence. In essence, pressure didn't corner India. It carved a clearer path for India's future. By transforming every challenge into an opportunity, India realized that external pressure was not a threat to its growth. It was the spark that pushed the nation to evolve faster than anyone predicted. As India began stepping away from outdated trade expectations, it quickly realized something powerful. No nation becomes a global leader by standing alone. Strength comes from choosing the right partners, partners who see your value, respect your growth, and treat you as an equal. For years, India's primary trade relationships were with nations that expected compliance rather than collaboration. But as India's confidence and capabilities grew, the old alliances no longer fit its ambitions. This pushed India to look outward, not for approval, but for alignment. The world was changing fast. New economic corridors were emerging in Asia, technology hubs were rising in the Middle East, and European markets were opening up to diversified partnerships. India recognized these shifts and moved swiftly. Instead of clinging to traditional relationships, India built new ones, stronger, balanced, and forward-looking. These partnerships were not based on pressure or dependency, but on mutual benefit. Nations across Asia welcomed India's manufacturing power. The Middle East sought India's technology and energy collaboration. Europe saw India as a stabilizing force in a turbulent world. Together, these ties formed a new network more resilient than any single alliance India had relied on in the past. The beauty of this strategy was simple. By expanding its circle, India reduced the influence any single country had over its economy. No one nation could dictate terms, slow India down, or threaten its momentum. Instead, India created a global web of opportunity, one where innovation, trade, and security were shared goals rather than bargaining chips. This shift altered the global balance of power. Nations that once assumed India would remain dependent suddenly found themselves competing for India's partnership. India didn't isolate itself, it diversified. And in doing so, it transformed from a country seeking support into a country others sought support from. At the heart of India's bold decision to step away from certain trade relationships was a simple but powerful truth. A nation cannot rise if its dignity is negotiable. For years, India accepted agreements that offered access, but not respect, cooperation, but not equality. These deals often came with conditions that shaped India's choices, influenced its industries, and limited its independence. India followed them because the nation was still growing, still building, still finding its place in the global system. But as India evolved, the tone of these relationships did not, and that imbalance became impossible to ignore. India began asking itself a deeper question. What kind of future does it want? One where it remains dependent on the approval of others, or one where it defines its own rules? The answer was clear. True strength comes not from the size of your economy alone, but from the freedom to make decisions that protect your people, your industries, and your future without external pressure. India realized that accepting trade terms designed for a weaker version of itself was not just limiting, it was disrespectful to the progress the country had made. That is why dignity became central to every choice. India wanted partnerships based on fairness, not fear, agreements based on balance, not dominance, dialogue based on equality, not instructions. Walking away from old deals wasn't about breaking ties, it was about breaking expectations. Expectations that India would stay silent, stay small, or stay predictable. By choosing dignity, India unlocked a new kind of confidence. It showed the world that it would not compromise its sovereignty for convenience or short-term gain. It would not allow its economy to be shaped by countries that didn't recognize its rise, and it would not let anyone else decide what its limits should be. India stood up not to provoke, but to claim the respect it had earned through decades of growth, innovation, and resilience. In the end, this moment isn't just about trade. It's about identity. It's about a nation that refused to let history, pressure, or outside expectations define its future. India didn't walk away out of anger, it walked away out of strength. It chose innovation over dependency, fairness over compromise, and dignity over convenience. That single decision didn't just reshape India's trajectory, it reshaped the global landscape. What we are witnessing right now is the rise of a country that no longer waits for opportunities. It creates them. A country that no longer accepts the terms set by others. It writes its own. A country that doesn't ask for respect, it commands it through action, discipline, and vision. This is not the story of conflict. This is the story of transformation. The story of a nation stepping into its full power. The story of India deciding, finally, unapologetically, to lead. If you believe in the power of nations to rise, if you believe in the courage to break old limits, then let this message be more than just a speech. Share it, talk about it, question the old rules, challenge the outdated narratives, and most importantly, support the leaders, innovators, and thinkers who are rebuilding the world in real time. Because the next chapter of global power isn't written by those who stay silent. It's written by those who stand up and choose a new direction, just like India did. So don't just watch history happen. Be part of the force that shapes it. Thank you for your time, your energy, and your open mind. Thank you for listening with curiosity, not judgment, and thank you for being part of a conversation that truly matters. Stay strong, stay aware, stay committed to the truth, no matter how bold it is. Until next time, thank you and take care.